I'd like to thank Dr. Ackerman for giving me an opportunity to talk to you about American supernatural from an ancient point of view. Our concern is only to give you just some touch points between the modern and the ancient, to make some connections for us in ways that help us understand where our American monsters have come from. And I'm going to be talking about some various pieces of literature, but I wanted just to give you a smattering of what it might mean for us to make connections between the ancient and the modern when it comes to the supernatural elements of life that we find around us and that all ancient peoples have engaged in one form or another. So, supernatural evil exists, and generally speaking, that is true universally across the board. All cultures, all peoples, all places, all times have in one way or another dealt with the supernatural. We see this in movies all the time. For instance, in Solomon Kane, probably not a very well-known film, but an important film nonetheless, I think, as it relates to the issue of supernatural evil and horror specifically. Bassett comes across with a very serious take on evil, and it's a very important movie in this regard, and I think well worth our time and attention. So supernatural evil does exist, and it exists across cultures and throughout literature. So I know that you're reading all kinds of great literature in American supernatural, and I'm really glad for this, and really glad for Dr. Ackerman's abilities and gifts in this regard to acquaint you with these great pieces. But people all over the world have dealt with these kinds of issues. So for some time, I was teaching a course in a high school class, actually in a senior class in high school called Gothic Horror Literature. And we were engaging some of the great books such as Frankenstein and Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde and so on. And I'll touch on some of those ideas, but I'm only suggesting that here to make the point that all throughout literature, throughout world literature, we see an emphasis on the supernatural and upon evil and horror. So we shouldn't be surprised when we talk about the ancient connections to this as well. Understanding horror, I think it's important for us to recognize some of the concepts that come through, some of the American supernatural elements that we see around us. So when we talk about the American horror story, for instance, we're talking about the aberrations of order itself. So we see in these kinds of episodes in television that there are some real concerns over disorder, the things that we are afraid of and that the supernatural world confronts us with. And then there are the abominations of nature. We see this in the Saw series. This is a very awful series, quite frankly, one that I haven't seen and don't want to see. But it gives us this kind of understanding that nature itself can skew humanity, and that humanity can skew nature. That goes both ways. So, two of the things that I always talk about when it comes to supernatural elements, and specifically about evil and horror, are two ideas, and I think it's really powerful for us to confront these ideas. One is that evil exists and must be defeated. We see this consistently in film. So whenever you're talking about a horror movie, you're always talking about some kind of evil element. Now, the evil may not be supernatural, and it may be something simply natural. That by itself is a discussion point, by the way, that goes into lots of different films. I'm thinking now about The Exorcism of Emily Rose, for instance. That kind of question you are left with in the film. Is this supernatural, or is this simply natural? So we do see, nonetheless, that evil exists and it must be defeated. And we have this kind of element that runs through film. But there's a second point that needs to be highlighted, and that is that the supernatural world is acknowledged. Even if we don't believe in it ourselves, even if we don't believe, let's say, in gods or demons or devils or any kind of supernatural heaven or hell, even if we don't believe in those things, the people that are writing the books, the people that are writing the stories, the people that are making the films are confronting us with this nonetheless. And the supernatural element must at least be taken seriously when we confront literature and film. So those two things, evil exists and the supernatural world must be acknowledged. Now, I want to just go back to the ancient world for a moment in just a few minutes, just to give, again, touch points to this for the American supernatural experience. Of course, the famous story about Pandora, and this particular quote comes from Roger Shattuck in his book Forbidden Knowledge, and he says this: "Curiosity claims a major role in our lives. At the same time, we have to register limits to knowledge. No story records these conflicting motifs better than the earliest Hebrew creation story, which opens the first book of Torah." Torah are the first 5 books of the Old Testament written by Moses. And so we have these kinds of elements in Jewish literature. I will refer to it as Hebraic literature, but nonetheless it has Jewish origins, and we use that kind of terminology today. So the earliest issues of curiosity, the earliest issues of the supernatural are being confronted in this book called Genesis, in the first book of Torah. I'll just say another word about this. That is that this particular book, based on viewpoints at least that comes from certain points of view, suggests that Moses wrote this book after the Exodus, that is, after the Exodus from Egypt. And this book then was basically Yahweh's, God's viewpoint of the world itself. Now, when I speak of God or Yahweh, I'm speaking about it from that element of tradition and Hebraic tradition. Not that you have to believe in this, but that this is nonetheless an element that many people around the world actually do believe in. And so when we think about the book of Genesis then, we take with us this kind of concept of curiosity and the idea that God is actually establishing his own supernatural worldview. So there were monsters in the ancient world, and these monsters were in cosmic clashes with each other. Probably if you have watched any kind of the movies about Alien versus Predator, you're going to be encountering these kinds of concepts on a regular basis. The whole idea that these kinds of animals or these kinds of creatures have existed really harkens back to the great clashes of Marduk versus Tiamat. And these things come out of the ancient Enuma Elish myth in the Babylonian Valley in the Middle East. And so when you're thinking about these kinds of touch points between the American supernatural and the ancient Near Eastern world, keep in mind that American supernatural does not stand by itself. It has origins beyond itself. So there were great sea creatures, and these sea creatures were given monster status. And again, in this Babylonian epic of the Enuma Elish, the water and darkness were both seen as forces of chaos. Chaos is personified by Tiamat in this particular story. And so when we think about this, we have to ask ourselves the question about the supernatural: is there a chaotic element to it? And is that chaotic element being overcome in the American supernatural experience? So in the Babylonian epic, the gods need to tame Tiamat. And so we have this kind of great conflict that is going on in the ancient world. But in Genesis, in this book, the first book of Torah, the law of God from the Hebraic point of view, this particular book suggests that God created the great sea creatures, and it's a one-sentence summary in the book of Genesis in chapter 1 of Genesis. To the Hebrews, these things were but simply a created part of the world. And when we think about the created world, again, from a Hebraic point of view, we're talking about a world that's now under Yahweh's, under God's control. It's really important to recognize this, that God is the one who neutralizes chaos. So keep that in mind. You're going to be encountering and have already been encountering literature and film that deals with supernatural evil and horrific elements. But the question then becomes, okay, who's going to overcome all of that? From the Hebrew tradition, there is this God that they believe in that actually does this. So, when we're talking about the Mesopotamian world, and I'll keep with the water theme just for this particular video that I'm shooting, water was considered to be a mysterious force, literally a monster in pagan tales. Keep that in mind when you're thinking about, again, this connection to chaos, because ultimately this is what Genesis was combating. Again, if we take it from God's perspective or his interpretation of the world, this is what we are viewing. So the function is very short and sweet in Genesis, and that is that God simply creates these sea creatures, and that's it. He's the one who has control over them. In that way, from the Hebraic point of view, creation is orderly and not chaotic. So, if you run all the way to the end of the Christian Bible, so all the way to the end of the book of Revelation, you find some very interesting connections between the book of Revelation and the book of Genesis. In the book of Revelation, we find that there is this emphasis that at the end of time, that is from a Hebraic Christian tradition perspective, at the end of time, there will be no more sea, there will be no more night, there will be no more death, and ultimately no more chaos, which is the intention of the idea that's coming out of Genesis. Again, these are Hebrew and Christian traditions, and these kinds of ideas then come forward to us in the American experience. In one way or another, all people everywhere deal with the supernatural and that evil exists and must be defeated and overcome. And within those aberrations, within those abominations, we see the necessity of something that is going to create order out of this chaos, or at least that's what we want. So, supernatural evil. Very important and powerful in books like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I've actually included here a slide of Spencer Tracy in the 1941 version of Jekyll and Hyde. I literally have been with students, high school and college students, who refuse to watch the 1941 black and white because it is so powerful. They literally feel the evil emanating out of the screen. And I have heard students say, I refuse to watch this film any further because I feel the power of that evil coming through. Whether or not you take the same perspective or not really doesn't matter. What I'm suggesting here is only that there is an element of supernatural evil that we see even in American cinema. These universal themes, when I'm speaking now about Jekyll and Hyde, we find them everywhere. And I could go on and on about the themes that we find throughout American film. Here is just one of them, Mr. Brooks. When we think about Mr. Brooks, this is a great picture. It gets after the Jekyll and Hyde concepts and the themes that literally engulf us as we think about our own personal lives. When we think about American supernatural, you can't leave yourself out because you have to ask yourself the question, what are these feelings that I have? What are these senses that I have of some other world, and that these things are coming from within me and I feel the pressure from without me? Those are the kinds of ideas that are important to maintain. So, I can't not talk about the supernatural without talking about Stephen King and his famous and fabulous work throughout the decades. I also want to acquaint you, however, with the great director Frank Darabont. Frank Darabont is the one who did such movies as The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile and The Mist. And guess what? Stephen King wrote all three of those. They are great novellas, and they're very important ideas, again, about the supernatural world. But I have to claim a real fascination for and an appreciation for Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, my favorite atheist, has said this: whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not himself become a monster. What a powerful and important idea. If we're invested with supernatural elements, if we're invested with evil, if we are concerned with ideas out of American supernatural or ancient touch points to it, we should be considerate of this idea that perhaps, just perhaps, the real problems we face are within ourselves. And so, to end, we need to end with just a concept or a frame about Frankenstein, and this wonderful statement out of Frankenstein's monster, when he says that men appear to me as monsters. I love Blaise Pascal's famous line that when he considers the human person, he thinks of the human person as an incomprehensible monster. When you're thinking about American supernatural, when you're thinking about touch points to the ancient world and to ancient supernatural elements, don't forget that the elements that we need to address, perhaps most powerfully of all, are those things which reside within us and the difficulties we find in our own human nature.